Hello, and welcome to A Path Forward, a podcast that discusses the substance use crisis and the work being conducted in Otero, Crowley, Bent, and Conejos counties. Our goal is to help find solutions to the crisis, with a special emphasis on the response activities happening in southern rural Colorado counties. My name is Terry Schreiber, and I am your host. I am the CEO and founder of the Schreiber Research Group, or TSRG, a Colorado-based nonprofit working in partnership with the Otero County Health Department to bring you this podcast. The funding for this podcast is provided by the Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA. The Department of Health and Human Services is part of the Rural Communities Opioid Response Program, or RCORP Implementation Grant. Please note that the views and comments of presenters and guests are their own. Also, the views expressed by the speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. In today's podcast, we are pleased to have Dr. Heidi McNeely, Dr. Steve Wright, and Kristin Carpenter to complete our three-part segment on stigma. We will be discussing stigma as it relates to the use of medications for opioid use disorder, or MOUD, language choices, and some functional actions people can take to help reduce stigma. Heidi McNeely is a nurse researcher with over 20 years' experience. Dr. Steve Wright is a family-trained physician board-certified physician with over 40 years' experience, who has been practicing addiction medicine and medical pain management. Kristin Carpenter is an external relations strategist for the Colorado Consortium for Prescription Drug Abuse Prevention serving Southeast Colorado. I'm going to begin with a question for Dr. Wright. Can you please provide an overview of what MOUD, or medications for opioid use disorder, are?
Thank you, Terry. I appreciate being here for this conversation today. MOUD, medication for opioid use disorder, is a relatively new term now used to reference the use of medication in the treatment of opioid use disorder. It supplants or replaces the previous term, medication-assisted treatment, MAT, but it's not just a term change for no reason, but it's a change in concept, how we understand treatment of the disease of addiction, and actually how stigma might be involved in previous ways that we thought about the disease and the individuals that have it. MAT, medication-assisted treatment, actually had practical value because the term embraces the use of medications for a wide range of substance addictions. And indeed, there are a number of medications used for various addictions like alcohol, tobacco, and food addiction. There is, however, a problem with that in that it sets addiction apart from other medical problems. We don't, for example, call it medication-assisted diabetic treatment when insulin is used. And the problem with setting addictions apart is that it is the entry point for stigma, starting with addiction being different. And for those that are not affected, this is a, quote, not us, end quote, which then leads to stigmatizing cascade that becomes individuals being different and to be feared and regarded as inferior, weak-willed, or simply living some wild hedonistic dream oblivious to the concerns of others around him or her. We also came to understand that medications by themselves can work alone, although this is not true for everyone, since addiction therapy, typically in the form of cognitive behavioral therapy and 12-step processes, can be quite valuable and indeed essential for some of those with the disease. The use of assisted implies that medications can never be the only approach, and indeed, it can be for some individuals. Even so, I think it's best to offer not only medications, but also addiction therapy and 12-step at the front end for all patients, followed by a sorting out as to what works for each individual person.
Thank you. Dr. McNeely, can you talk to us a little bit about why there's such a difference in how society views medication to treat an opioid use disorder versus medication to treat diabetes as it relates to stigma?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I appreciate being here as well. As Dr. Wright said, there are stigmas around many different diseases, and definitely what we've experienced and what we observe in comparison of medication for opioid use disorder compared to other medications is pretty significant. I think as a society, we have struggled to view substance use and opioid use disorder as a disease. And I think first and foremost, until we get to a place where we recognize those as diseases, it will be continued to be wrought with stigma and misbeliefs and things that we'll need to work through. Um, for example, we were talking about diabetes. We have definitely always treated that within the medical model. And we know that people seek care for a disease like diabetes. And we expect that as part of that disease process, that they're required to take medication like insulin or another medication. It's a very natural and expected part of their treatment course. But we haven't yet wrapped our minds around the effectiveness and importance of using medications in medications for opioid use disorder when it's necessary or when it's helpful to treat substance use disorder. And so I think, the stigma is one part, and that clearly has been part of our society for decades. I think, it's hard because we talked a little bit about this in a previous podcast, but we have associated substance use as a legal criminal type issue. And because we've dealt with it outside of the medical arena and we have criminalized substance use in the past, I think we have some more challenges to get to a place where we can start to view it as a medical disease or disorder that needs to be treated just like other medical diseases and disorders. And often that includes and involves medication for the use of those. I think it's important to understand that the functioning within the human brain and human body when you're under the influence of substances is a component that is often not well understood. And just like we provide insulin for individuals with diabetes to help augment and support their pancreas to do what it needs to do, there are medications available that can help do the same thing to help treat and support the brain and how the brain releases dopamine and other agents and how it functions. And so starting to normalize that is going to be a big step for us in approaching this topic specifically.
I'd like to enlarge a little bit on that. We have laws in this country, often for very good reasons. In part, they are established to help address actual harm done by an individual or individuals or entities that are organizations or even corporations. They are established also to help address the potential for actual harm that is where substantial risk is involved, such as impaired driving, even when an accident has not occurred. However, we have come to understand that addictive substance use in and of itself, without major harm or in circumstances where there is significant risk, is primarily a medical matter. And so it does not make sense for the heavy-handed legal consequences that we've invoked often in relation to substance use.
I agree, Dr. Wright. And I think another challenge to that is that within the criminal justice system, it is not the best place to manage, and care for diseases and to be able to provide medical treatment. That is not the purpose of those systems. And so it is really challenging when we have, decided that's where we're going to provide treatment and care to individuals that would be better served within the healthcare system. So appreciate that you shared that.
Thank you both. I'm wondering, Dr. Wright, can you remind our listeners of what the definition of disease is as it relates to people who use drugs?
Certainly. There is a lot of debate about what a disease is as compared to a syndrome or a condition and words like that. But disease is basically a medical condition that embraces a set of symptoms, a set of functional responses to those symptoms, often disabling, and a medical point of view for a patient. These symptoms may improve in relation to treatment and devolve in terms of not treating these individuals. There are a couple articles by McCullen in the early 2000s that describe this phenomenon as it relates to how we consider hypertension, diabetes, other medical conditions. And we do recognize that there are quite similarities, as he explains in that particular article. We do recognize that addiction as a disease is involuntary. There's distinct neurophysiology. It's genetically based in 60 to 80%, environmentally influenced, and treatment adherence about 40 to 60%, with return to use features that are very similar to the return to problems in relation to hypertension and diabetes. And finally, then there is a predictable course if treated and a predictable course if untreated.
Thank you. In the last segment, we also talked a little bit about the brain being hijacked and that being a feature of the disease model. And I'm wondering if you could revisit that topic briefly as well.
Certainly. Briefly, there is no one center in the brain or pathway that reflects entirely addiction. We see the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center. We see the locus coeruleus, the area of the brain that reflects the symptoms of withdrawal. We see learned memory involved as well. But the primary thing is probably the prefrontal cortex, the executive part of the brain that says no to some of the impulses and desires that we might have, really seems to be hijacked. And the decision making associated with that is limited or even absent for individuals with the disease of addiction. And so their experience is, I just have to have a substance no matter what, get out of my way.
Thank you. Next, I was hoping that you could describe for our audience why 12-step programs sometimes appear to be anti-MOUD or medications for opioid use disorder.
Yeah, the 12-step programs, of course, really emphasize the importance of abstinence from the substance that is of concern in and of itself, but also substances that might potentially become a problem for individuals not currently experiencing them. Even in the beginning, however, 12-step and the big book and associated literature allowed for the appropriate use of medications for individuals that have a need to do so when they're prescribed appropriately by medical physicians. But even so, there has tracked through the history of the 12-step groups over the years that somehow you're not in recovery if you're taking a substance that is related to the substance that you have a problem with. But the definition of addiction is compulsion, loss of control, continued use in spite of adverse consequences. And in the case of opioid use disorder, the use of methadone, which is an opioid, or buprenorphine, which is an opioid, is not associated with, in appropriate circumstances, compulsion, loss of control, continued use in spite of adverse consequences. Indeed, their lives are getting better in that particular context. So for those particular opioids in that particular context, those substances one is not addicted to, but it is an appropriate treatment process. We still wrestle with that, however, as we carry the baggage of how we understood this in the past.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that, we haven't called it out, but a common thing that we hear working in this field is that we're just replacing one drug for another when we provide medication for opioid use disorder. And I just want to call that out because, again, I think that is a thought and an understanding that's perpetuating the stigma instead of being able to recognize medications, just like we use them for other disease processes, are helping to normalize the body function. They're augmenting what's not working well. And in order to do that, it is giving the individual's bodies and themselves time to recover so that they can function and live their life to their best of their ability.
Thank you so much. I'd like to move the conversation to talk about some practical things that we can actually begin to do to reduce stigma. This includes using people-first language and reducing the use of stigmatizing language. Dr. McNeely, could you talk a little bit about what this means and why it is so important?
Yeah, absolutely. People first language is something that was a big part of my graduate studies, as well as something I've been able to put into practice. But it is something that is challenging, and also we don't see regularly used, especially within healthcare. And so ultimately, people first language is about identifying every person that you interact with as a person first. We know that there's many things about ourselves and our lives that make up who we are and our identity. One of those things may be that we have a certain disease or condition that we live with, but it may also be a fact that we're a parent or we're a certain type of professional. There are many things that we can identify ourselves with. And so, historically, when we look back in healthcare, it's been very common to identify people who come in to a healthcare setting for treatment based on their disease or their diagnosis. So very commonly you will hear, and you also hear this on TV and media and other places. Hey, the diabetic patient in room 3 needs care or needs their medication, or are you caring for the addict in room 5? Right? I mean, these are very, very normalized within this context. So, in order to use person first language, we're really saying, I am treating and caring for and interacting with a person first. And this person may have a disease or a diagnosis. And so, using language like my friend who has a substance use disorder, or the individual that I'm treating in room 3 that is here because of a cocaine overdose. Things like that are ways that we can start to shift and frame our language. It recognizes and views the person from a lens of humanity first, focusing then on the disease or the reason why they're there seeing us. I know that Dr. Wright has some great examples too of other language that we could use, and that is very common, especially in healthcare, that might be having perpetuated stigma, but taking a slight change to how we use those terms.
Well, if I could amplify what you said previously here about person first language, I think it's important to discriminate that the disease of addiction is a valid term. Calling it a disease calls for understanding as such, orientation of medical and related services, and support throughout the community of individuals that are significant others and the society as a whole. However, to say you are an addict often implies that's all you are. You are a disease. But to say you are a person with the disease of addiction allows for a number of different things. First of all, it allows for patient engagement to be much more effective when you recognize that this individual is so much more than the disease of addiction. It allows for better understanding of the nature of the disease with persons with addiction, their significant others, medical practitioners, and society as a whole. And this is not an end in of itself, but it leads more effectively into appropriate treatment policies and regulations.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, Dr. Wright, can you share a few examples of language that might perpetuate stigma?
Sure. There are a number of terms that we are now understanding to be used in the past that may no longer be appropriate for how we understand things currently. Abuse, for example, substance abuse. Well, that's problematic in a variety of ways. First of all, we don't hurt the substances in and of themselves. Second is the diagnostic book DSM-4, which now is DSM-5. DSM-4 used the term abuse, which we now consider with the criteria involved to be mild addiction. Abuse is pejorative in the sense that we seem to imply an understanding of the motivational characteristics of an individual. So, for example, we would prefer to use other terms when we're talking about substance-related problems. So, for example, misuse, which means taking it for the correct reason when it's prescribed, but in the incorrect amount, such as double dosing. Non-medical use, using it for a reason other than what's indicated medically. In the case of alcohol, for example, which is not prescribed, of course, there can be used terms like harmful use or hazardous use. But it goes well beyond that. We've discussed the issue of person with addiction, just like person with a disability, person with diabetes, and that's very appropriate. We also have terminology that is pejorative as well. Dirty and clean urine, we recommend using expected or not expected results on a urine testing. Detox employs as if one is poisoned, and we prefer the terms withdrawal or discontinuation. Drug of choice tends to imply that we think that individuals choose to use the substance that they're using. And indeed, with the hijacked brain, that's not the case, and drug of use is probably more appropriate. Treatment compliance tends to load the blame on patients. We prefer treatment adherence. Relapse, also pejorative in its use. Return to use is probably the better terminology, and to attach to that for individuals that do return to use, what do we now need to do that we weren't doing before, are helpful words as well. Drug-free also tends to imply that we really don't want individuals on methadone or buprenorphine when in fact that can be life-saving and really important. And it's not just that, terms that other people use, but self-stigma, like junkie, which demeans the individual that speaks in those terms as if that might be a motivating factor for them to get better. And we don't see that demotivation, that the use of disparaging terms is helpful for individuals to move forward in a recovery process.
Thank you so much. I'd like to bring Kristin into this conversation. So, Kristin, when we meet, you often talk about a couple of concepts that are very functional and operational in terms of reducing stigma. One of them is SAMHSA's 4 pillars of recovery: health, home, purpose, and community. And one of them is recovery-friendly workplaces. Can you describe what those are for the audience and tell us why you think these are really valuable steps that can be taken?
Yeah, of course. Dr. Wright touched on the DSM-5 and some of the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder. And when I do community trainings, I like to share those criteria because several of them are measured through relationship breakdowns or continued high-risk behavior in the face of negative consequences. And I think typically stigma is rooted from this place of substance use disorders as an ongoing choice. Individuals wake up every day and they're choosing to continue this risky behavior, even though it's to the detriment of themselves or their families, and even the world around them. And I think seeing how unique the diagnostic criteria is for substance use disorder can be a really helpful first step in breaking down stigma. So I appreciate your mention of that. I also think for people who don't have a direct link to substance use disorder, maybe they don't have a person in their lives who struggles, it can be really easy for them to make those conclusions, but also they can keep the issue far away. It's something that when they close their door, it doesn't follow them into their house. When it's not in my home, it's not something in my immediate circle, it's really easy, or it's not in the field that I work in. I think that's where people are mistaken, is this assumption that they don't have an active role in impacting substance use disorder or supporting people in recovery if they're not in direct proximity to them, and they're wrong. So a lot of times people, especially those newly into recovery, they've done a lot of hard work, they've received treatment, they're trying very hard to get to a place where they can reintegrate into the world around them. Maybe that's through work. Maybe they want to re-engage as a parent, attend parent-teacher conferences, just really to start participating in community again and plugging back in, whatever that might look like. And they have to take that first step. And where it can be really damaging for those individuals is when that person takes that first step, they're demonstrating that bravery and they're being vulnerable, and they're met with organizations or individuals who've kept that proximal distance and said, this isn't my problem, and therefore don't have meaningful ways to receive that person. So we talk a lot about people who use drugs, they need treatment, they need support. And where we don't talk as much is around the skill sets that people who consider themselves far away from the issue, they need to have to be better receivers of people who are in recovery, because they have the potential to do a lot of damage if they don't have those skill sets. And all of that is fed through stigma and just a lack of education. So what I like is SAMHSA put together the 4 pillars of lasting recovery. They're home, health, purpose, and community. And what I love about them is that there really isn't a person on the planet, there isn't a person in this conversation today who doesn't need those 4 things. We seek them out in our own ways. And I mean, they're integral to our health and our happiness. And right now, the societal system that we have set up is entirely reliant on my family of origin to do everything for me. Early on in life, they need to help me develop my moral compass. They need to feed me, clothe me, provide my comfort, my emotional and developmental support, and then stability as I grow up. And so the family you're born into really acts as that entire foundation for our understanding of personal dynamics. And they also help us build that understanding of home, health, purpose, and community. And that system is completely reliant on my caregiver's ability to do that, right? So if I didn't grow up in a home where those elements can be nurtured, there are very few alternative environments for me to seek out. And in that same sense, around community, we just don't have that mentality of it taking a village, or we, as soon as young people graduate high school, there's really this cliff where they fall off and those supports are no longer there. But we're still pack animals. From the time we're born until we die, we're pack animals who are constantly seeking those connections. So if I'm not from a family where those connections are deep-rooted from the time I'm born, I will seek them out. And if I don't find them, I will supplement them with something. It could be sex, it could be drugs, it could be shopping, gambling, exercise, food, whatever that looks like. I will find that connection and that thing that relieves the stress, the whatever I'm feeling. I will find it, and we're hardwired for it as human beings. So so when people reach a place of recovery, they still need those things. They need healthy options available to them. And I think that's really a great place for the community to start plugging in and be better receivers of people who are in recovery and start taking on some of that responsibility. Because another element of stigma is that when people fall off that cliff and they don't have that foundational support, we then blame them for it. But if they never had the skills, somebody has to come in and really help them build that up and be that place where they can plug in safely. I don't think I spoke to the recovery-friendly communities. I apologize. One of the things, so through recovery-friendly workplace initiatives, that's part of where we can be better supporters of people in recovery. So it just isn't realistic for a person to enter recovery and then meet them with continued shame and punishment and limit their employment and connection options and then wonder why they're not thriving. So what I like about recovery-friendly employment or workplace options is it gives somebody a place to plug in, and it gives them some safety and also some support. So it's essentially a workplace agreeing to take on the responsibility within themselves to learn more about substance use disorder and to be a better receiver of somebody who's in recovery. So through that process, ideally, they're going to revise some of their internal policies so that they're more accommodating of those who are in recovery. Maybe sick leave looks a little bit different if this is something that those staff need. Maybe they host supportive meetings in the office, or they agree not to have alcohol at their annual Christmas dinner, whatever that's going to look like. They will revise their internal policies and really learn to be better receivers, and we all benefit from that.
So all of that is very helpful. But Kristin, I want to sort of take you down a path, if you could, around how do we overcome the challenge where some people in recovery may have a criminal background, and we need to invite them back into the workforce, and how does that relate to the recovery-friendly workforce? Are you experiencing that as well in your work?
So the Recovery Friendly Workplace Initiative is new, and that is part of what's coming. We've been working with some of the manufacturing organizations in the area so it's sort of two-pronged, because on the one hand, we have a large number of people who have criminal backgrounds. And when you run that background check, things are going to come up for them, which even for them to apply requires a lot of vulnerability and some discomfort, right? So for those employers, we have employee shortages. I mean, nationwide at this point, post-COVID, there are positions available. And so what I like about recovery-friendly workplace is it gives some opportunity for people to really dig into how they can support people with a criminal background and really just help them plug back in. And so we have one organization down here that's in manufacturing, and they loosened their restrictions on criminal background checks. And I would have to give you the specifics around that, and then also around drug testing. So they have some safety planning that they're putting into place if somebody has a positive drug test at the time of their initial intake. And then they have a period where they have to work with them. And then eventually they do have to have a negative drug test, but they're working around machinery. So again, I think it's mutually beneficial, right? If I have a bunch of vacancies and I have an available workforce, how can I plug them in a way that gives them that purpose, gives them that drive? Because that's part of what purpose is. I wake up every morning. Why did I wake up? What am I going to do? How am I going to contribute to the world around me? And for some people, that's work. It might be a hobby. It could be a role that they play in their community. Maybe they're a parent or a friend or a caregiver. But whatever that looks like, work is a really important motivator for people. And it can help to keep them in a place of recovery and help them to become more effective community members as well.
I love that. Kristin, I don't think we've used the term recovery-friendly workplace in the healthcare field when we've seen examples of this and how we can really provide what we call like a soft place to land for someone who is in recovery coming back to work. And I think for healthcare professionals, which is predominantly the population that I work with, they have often been provided close monitoring and a program of support for up to 5 years after treatment. And I think those have been wildly successful for physicians, for nurses, for pharmacists, for others that are returning to work. And that includes engaging with the employer, providing information and being transparent. Urine tests that are done on a regular cadence and those results are shared with the employer. There's a level of accountability there, but also the recognition that we value this individual for what they contribute to the profession and into their role, and that we're allowing them to come back to work. We're providing some of those flexible schedules, and you need to attend a meeting. Okay, we make space and time for that. To be totally transparent, it's not done everywhere, and it's not fully embraced in every healthcare system across the country. I think we still have a long ways to go. But as you were talking about that, I think there are lots of ways to be creative in how we can support individuals to be successful as they're coming back to work.
Well, but even that mindset to say we value you in this workplace, we value the role that you filled, that right there is how we break down stigma, because you're saying, I don't see you just as a person in recovery. You're a nurse, you're a medical professional, you're an asset in a variety of ways. And this happens to be one piece of what makes you who you are. That right there is such a helpful mentality to take for people.
One of the great ironies of the way the system is built out at this particular time is that we do know for homeless individuals having a secure home situation is essential for initiating recovery. And yet, very often those places which might be home do not allow individuals in that are actively using at this particular time, and yet they can't get started until they have a good housing situation, or in the case of having a job, to have the income to be able to support, because they have no effective insurance. So you need an income in order to be able to do that. Barriers to employment as a result of substance use. And so we have yet to crack that nut with regards to how to get people to able to enter into a recovery process.
No, it's so true. I was a child welfare caseworker for years, and I still have this haunting image of this mom who we took her children away from her because of substance use. And the children had already left, and I was speaking with her. She didn't have a couch in her apartment. It was a dirty mattress on the floor of the living room. There was no TV. There was no food in the cabinets. And I remember saying, okay, we're going to get you into treatment. We're going to get you clean, because that's still how we spoke back then. And she just looked at me like I was insane. And looking back on that now, I feel horrified that that was the expectation. I'm leaving her essentially in a cage. She's in an empty cage with nothing other than a dirty mattress to lay on, no food in her home. I've taken away her children that were her primary reason for getting up in the morning. And I'm expecting her to start a whole new life with no job, no supportive community, no close family who are not also struggling with substance use disorder. And then we're baffled. I remember years of being baffled and thinking, well, we took your children away. What's more motivating than taking your children away? And going back to that DSM-5 criteria, I just feel heartbroken about all of the things and opportunities that we missed because we didn't have an understanding of how deeply substance use hijacks the brain. And that's not mom driving mom anymore, right? Like, that's substance use disorder. And it's one example of how deeply stigma and how deeply our misunderstanding of substance use can impact the entire trajectory of children and their families and their parents.
Kristin, that's a great example of how we within the treatment community have not always been supportive in the way that we need to be for individuals in recovery. And so I think of the language of come back when you're ready, or come back when you've done enough more research. In other words, research using alcohol, for example, and having negative consequences. When those individuals needed to be supported, probably in a harm reduction manner, but also to keep in touch on a regular basis to help them. Even within the language of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a real challenge. For example, the word powerlessness. So the first step says we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. Well, if I'm in that circumstance, I don't want to be powerless. I want to be empowered. And the first message, the first step out of the box is this powerlessness. And it needs to be reconceived in terms of how we frame this for our individuals. So it's powerlessness with regards to the substance to which we are addicted to. However, not powerlessness to everything. I may have power to be able to get into treatment with assistance, and with assistance, I don't have that powerlessness anymore. But with assistance, I can do my part. Others can do their part in both supportive and treatment ways, and we could be able to move this along into a recovery process.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, Heidi, we often talk about the self-stigma and how people are battling their own internal demons around their worthiness. And I'm just wondering if you can sort of add that to the conversation about how that plays a role.
Yeah, absolutely. I was definitely having thoughts about that as we were talking. It's hard enough when you walk into a new housing center or a new potential employer, and you're worried about how they're receiving you or the way in which they're receiving you is not supportive, because already most of these individuals who have substance use disorder, even if they've gone to treatment and they're, in recovery and they're actively healing and, rebuilding kind of that life that has crumbled somewhat throughout their disease process, they often still carry so much self-stigma. So they're already within their head saying, I'm not adequate, I'm not worthy, I am powerless, especially if that's been reiterated in treatment. And so having those your own thoughts, your own barriers that you're restricting yourself from being able to do these things just are manifested and made even bigger barriers when they're reinforced in the interactions you have with other people and in the experiences you have when you're trying to, find a house, find a job, support your kids, get back involved in the school, whatever, to try to get back and go to family dinners again and re-engage and rebuild some of those relationships. And so I think it's a huge, thing to think about. What are each of our roles? As Kristin led to earlier, she was saying, the whole it takes a village. We all have a responsibility, even if right now, today, we don't have someone in our lives that's walking through this, and we may not totally understand it. We all have a responsibility and an obligation. I think, those biases that we have, the stigma that we carry, some of that's deeply rooted and not always at the forefront of our mind or obvious that it's there. And so I feel each of us as individuals has the obligation to start to unpack some of that, to start to bring it to the surface, to start to understand why it's there, and to get rid of and break down some of those myths of what is and what isn't really true. And so, yeah, I appreciate that question.
I love that. I think it makes me feel really encouraged about the medical field in the future, just to know that this is sort of the broad direction people are headed, and the way that we're thinking about human beings is not just a single thing. Is just, I think it's a lot more impactful and powerful, and it leaves me feeling a lot more warm and fuzzy. And I should have noted, my DHS days, it's been almost 10 years since I was in the child welfare realm, and they have since taken on so much more effective and impactful approaches to doing that work, and it's wonderful. Yeah, I think it's really comforting to hear that this is the case. And also, one of the things about the four pillars of recovery that I maybe would like to expand upon is that those should really be encouraged even during active substance use, right? So I can't expect somebody to reach a place of abstinence or tapering down their use if they don't have a safe place to lay their head, if they don't have basic access to mental health and healthcare services, including, if that's useful for them, MOUD or treatment of some sort. And then purpose. Why are you waking up? I can't take the very reason you wake up in the morning, if that's your children, and then say, we'll get better, right? And then we'll give your purpose back. You need to have access to your purpose as often as humanly possible. And then you have to have a community to share it with. Because I think for people with substance use disorder, we don't take into account the community piece. Even if it's not a quote unquote healthy community, if they're with other people who also use drugs, and they have camaraderie, they have support, they have a network around them, and that may be something that for a lot of people they were lacking. And so when we're asking them to stop using a substance or to enter treatment, we're also asking them to leave the community that they know, and we have to have a new community ready for them, to receive them, and to be ready to be their supports, because they're giving up a lot, not just that drug of choice.
This is awesome. I really want to thank all of you for being part of this Stigma series on A Path Forward. And as we wrap up the segment, I'd like to offer each of you the opportunity to share some closing remarks if you have any.
Bias, stigma, and discrimination are not simply perspectives that reside in someone else. It is inevitable that we have certain formed opinions that may or may not be accurate. Each one of us carries the culture of where and how we grew up. This shapes us and shapes our perspectives. The language that we use grew up in a culture, its biases, its stigmas, and frankly, its discriminatory practices. Language is not simply a reflection of how we think of things, but it shapes us as we go forward on this. Our understanding about addiction has shifted dramatically, thanks in large part to evidence-based medicine and the stories of affected individuals and those close to them. It is quite important, therefore, that each one of us, and I include myself here, look at oneself critically and ask, how am I thinking about and acting in ways that might be off-center and therefore not helpful for persons with addiction or society in which we live as a whole? How then might I be able to make a shift as to how I looked at the disease of addiction and who are affected by the disease? This can be a big ask for many of us, some because we just see the ugly side of addiction and not the evolving journey of recovery, because these individuals stay hidden, the individuals that are in recovery, knowing that they will be stigmatized and discriminated against. Some of us, because our own experience, we found it easy to step away from substance use ourselves and wonder why others can't do the same thing. Your experience, however, is just your experience. Others experience addictive substance use differently. We are all individuals. However, in one respect, we are all alike. Though we experience different life challenges, hardships, we all have them. San Juan de la Cruz said, "There comes a time in the journey when one passes through the dark side of the soul." This happens to all of us. Think of those challenges in your life when you could not move forward alone, when you needed assistance to do so. But what kind of assistance helped? What was helpful? What was harmful? Bias, stigma, and discriminatory practices. With this understanding, each one of us do have monumental difficulties. So speak with respect, and from our developing understanding of addiction, speak carefully and kindly and with a big heart. Thank you, all of you, for your willingness to consider these ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Wow, I don't know how to follow that, to be um, transparent. I think, we do just have to remember our own humanity in all of this as well. We talk about people first language and treating all of these individuals with respect and helping to meet their need and being that community and coming alongside of them. But we have to recognize that in ourselves too. Kristin talked about, 10 years ago, what it was like working in her field. I look back just 5, 6, 7 years ago in my field and see how much shift and movement just in my own experience, in my own mind, in my thoughts, in my own beliefs and all of that, and how far I've come. So I think we have to give our own selves grace a bit in how we're interacting with people all around us, and those that, maybe individuals who have substance use or a history of substance use, and how we're meeting them where they're at and how we're supporting them and how we're building communities that support every individual, regardless of where they're at in the walk of life, that we support them as humans first and foremost. And so I absolutely appreciate this discussion and also am encouraged about the future that's before us.
I would just share that for people who don't have that close proximity to substance use disorder, I would really, really encourage you to start considering the fact that you actually do. I think we need to rid ourselves of this notion that we're not integral in combating substance use in the United States if it's not in close proximity to our every day. So if it's not happening in your immediate family, you're fortunate, but you still live in communities where substance use is rampant. You live in a nation that's overwhelmed by substance use, where behavioral health and treatment workforce is completely overburdened and understaffed, and your tax dollars and spending are reaching new heights to try to address the multitude of issues around healthcare, criminal justice, social services, and the list really goes on. So you're being impacted, whether directly or indirectly, and all of our futures are really being shaped each day by how we choose to respond and engage with these issues. So I also think for people in decision-making positions to couple person first language, like Heidi's spoken about, person first planning is another really great way to give that legs and some momentum and think about how am I making sure that all of my community has access to home health, purpose, and community, and how can I propel those missions forward in my role. Thank you. This was fun.
Thank you all for joining us. I want to go back to this for just a moment about when we started doing the work in Otero and Crowley counties. We did interviews with people with lived experience, and frequently the topic came up about how much stigma there is in rural communities, and specifically in those rural communities about people who use drugs. So the reason that we dedicated 3 segments to the topic of stigma is we want to begin to do the work to remove stigma everywhere we can. We think it's really important that the community recognizes that the people who use drugs are experiencing stigma might actually avoid seeking treatment because of their fear associated with that stigma. So our goal overall for this podcast is to bring you content that will help educate you on some of the core issues this community is facing. We hope you will continue to listen to the various topics. Thank you for tuning in to A Path Forward, a podcast funded by the Health Resources and Services Administration and brought to you by the Schreiber Research Group. Our goal is to discuss the substance use crisis and the work being conducted in Otero, Crowley, Bent, and Conejos counties. Our goal is to help find solutions to the crisis with a special emphasis on the response activities happening in rural counties. We want to thank Kristin Carpenter, Dr. Heidi McNeely, and Dr. Steve Wright for talking with us today about the stigma as it relates to the use of medications for opioid use disorder, or MOUD, the language choices and some functional actions people can take to help reduce stigma. Again, thank you for tuning in to this segment. My name is Terry Schreiber, and we hope you'll join us next time.